Alright guys, hello and welcome back to another video. So finally, after over a month of promises, I finally get to do the second part of my Halo 6 predictions. So without further ado, let's dive right into this. So right off the bat, right, and I'll be the first to admit, somebody has already beaten me to this. Hidden Xperia a while back did a video on something called the infinite loop theory. It basically states that the Halo universe is stuck in an infinite loop and will continue to do so until someone breaks the circuit. And it got me thinking. It got me to look back at my original theory. Upon further examination, if you look at a timeline of events that happened between the Forerunners and what's currently going on in the Halo universe in modern day time, I guess you could call it. There's a lot of striking similarities. Now things are different; they don't exactly pan out the same way, but by and large, if you stack up event by event, you'll see a pattern, so to speak. So, for example, with the Forerunners, you have a war with ancient humanity. That war, to some degree, cripples them, militarily speaking. And as for humanity, they face the Covenant. Now, the Forerunners' war with humanity was a prolonged campaign for the Forerunners. For humanity, it was, by comparison, a very short time period of just 30 years. Or so of that timeline, and both wars left both I guess you could say our main faction weakened. For humanity, weakened is a very generous term to use, whereas with the Forerunners, it was a bit of a stretch of the imagination until the Flood showed up. And so here's where we start getting more similarities. So, after the Forerunners had their war with the humans, and the humans had their war with the Covenant, both the Forerunners and the humans then proceeded to take measures to ensure that their opponent that they faced in said war, whether it be Forerunners or humans, made an effort to actually, I want to say crippled, but that's not the right word to use. They made an effort to make sure that they would never rise up again. So for the Forerunners, they de-evolved humanity and even split them up into different species so as to provide a challenge to their up and coming. With humanity, as we see in the Kilo 5 trilogy, the Office of Naval Intelligence took the route of arming a civil war conflict on Helios so that the elites, who was at the time perceived to be the bigger threat of all the factions to humanity, would continue to fight each other, and then one day the UNSC would come in and lay the final blow against the Singhili and make sure that they would never come back. And rightfully so. Correct? I mean, humanity, their fleet is in shambles, they're trying to rebuild. The last thing that they want is another problem to worry about. Really, this kind of is it doesn't exactly set up the future events. With the Forerunners, it was kind of like a side story that later became a primary focus, as de-evolving the humans later became into let's make sure that they are our rightful successors, whereas humanity has somewhat played both sides of the ball with the Singhili. For example, they play as the friends to the Arbiter, but they continue to give weapons to his opposition, stuff like that. What comes next, and this is a part that kind of got me to think a little bit, because for humanity, for the UNSC, I guess I should call them, there are two unexpected threats that show up. You could even argue three. Whereas with the Forerunners, it was one. And then it later evolved into a much bigger threat, which I will get into later. But as we all know with the story of the Forerunners, shortly after their war with humanity, the Flood show up. And at first the Forerunners treat it as a disease, but by the time that they realize that it's a military threat, and that it should be dealt with as one, the Flood is already just running loose on the galaxy. They really have no plan to defeat them, and that's when the Forerunners basically enact their final solution in the Halo array. Of course, there was a bunch of politics and events in the way, but by and large, that's what happened. With humanity and the UNSC, you could argue that the Didact was the first of the three possible unexpected threats, although he's dealt with relatively quickly. Julim Dama is a second, but not really. He was kind of like the guy that led up to the Didact. And then the fall of the Didact led to Cortana and the Created, which is the third and final unexpected threat, so to speak. And I guess you could combine this all into humanity has finally discovered Forerunner technology, and basically the danger that that Forerunner technology's presence just brings to the table, just for being, just for existing. And of course, it's fully brought to bear when Cortana just takes over everything at the end of Halo 5. So from here on out, if you look at what happens later on to the Forerunners, they continue to lose their fight with the Flood. Hundreds, if not thousands of worlds are infected by them. The Forerunners set up humanity to be the Reclaimers, so to speak. They build the Halo array. An unexpected betrayal, and I guess this is... I should probably redo this part, but... An unexpected betrayal. Mendicant Bias betrays the Forerunners. The Forerunners' decline continues to... At this point, it rapidly accelerates after Mendicant Bias's betrayal. Whereas with Cortana, her immediate sudden betrayal, which basically strikes everyone in surprise, so to speak, her betrayal is very swift, and that it just leaves the UNSC crippled, I assume. But moving forward, we all know what happens to the Forerunners at the end of all this. They activate the Halo array, they defeat the Flood, they reseed the galaxy, and we assume that the Forerunners exiled themselves or just completely disappeared. Now, we haven't gotten to this portion of the story, but in my opinion, I don't think it's a coincidence that I guess you could call it the after credit scene of Halo 5 shows Cortana, I guess you could say, controlling a Halo ring. The Halo ring kind of glows blue for a second, and then it dims out, so to speak, as Cortana is humming in the background. So I would assume that the Halo array will come into play. And considering the pattern of events that both the past storyline with the Forerunners and now with the UNSC is occurring, I think it's safe to say that we are headed again to another showdown at the Ark, where our heroes will be forced to decide whether to activate the array or not. And ultimately their decisions will have consequences for the galaxy. Now, I don't necessarily believe that the infinite loop will repeat itself, considering that I don't think anybody is thinking about reseeding the galaxy with life or anything like that, or starting anew. Not only that, but if you think about it, what would the Chief or Locke or Captain Lasky have anything to gain from activating a weapon that only affects living things and not an artificial intelligence like Cortana or the Created? It doesn't make any sense. The only way that the array would even be activated is if for some reason the remnants of the UNSC or whatever other faction out there that opposes the Created decide to basically band together and actually forms a considerable threat to the point where Cortana says, I'm not going to deal with this, I'm just going to get rid of the problem altogether. But by and large, it seems that Cortana is loyal to the ideal of the mantle. So I think at this point, the only logical answer to why someone would need to activate the array is if the flood showed up. And let's think about this for a second. The flood is not only a danger to living things, it's also a danger to artificial intelligences. Now, there's theories that people have come up with that Cortana is secretly infected with the logic plague, and that by her weakening the galaxy, it just makes it easy for the flood to show up and, just take over and do whatever they want. It's a legit theory, but what if, let's say, Cortana is 100% into this whole idea that the created, or in this, for lack of a better term, artificial intelligence is more suited to handle the mantle than living beings. So what if the flood shows up? Now, in one of the previous books in the Forerunner saga, it was mentioned that humanity would be tested again 100,000 years later, after the events of Primordium, if I remember correctly. And one could point to the events of Halo 2 and Halo 3 as being that test. But let's be honest, the flood wasn't really the primary focus of the original trilogy. It became a focus once the Covenant was dealt with, but it wasn't the original focus. And yes, I do realize that the reason for the Arbiter and the Chief to go to the Ark was so that they could find a way to stop the flood. But their priority the entire time was to stop the rings from firing, and then find the solution to the flood, and then execute that solution. And we all know what happens from there. A Halo ring is activated over the Ark. It's a tactical pulse. It only affects the Ark itself, and everybody escapes to some degree. But in my opinion, right, if this is supposed to be a lesson, right, because there's this old saying that says, those who do not pay attention to history are doomed to repeat it, or those who ignore it, rather. Let's say that for a second that the Infinity and the Chief and Locke, right? Let's say that they have their adventures across the galaxy and they actually stumble upon a Forerunner. And let's say that this Forerunner gives them the information, basically a brief, I guess you could say, Cliff Notes version of what happened to the Forerunners in the flood, and gives them a history lesson, or, a very brief lesson on the mantle and what it means. If humanity is to survive, or at least pass their test with the flood, then by default they can't activate the array. If they activate the array, they betray the ideas of the mantle. And keep in mind, the only reason why the Forerunners built the Halo array wasn't just so that they could defeat the flood. At first, it was heavily opposed by everyone, but then the Master Builder changed the terms and said, all right, we'll allow this reseeding process, we'll categorize all living beings in the galaxy, we'll put them on these rings, and eventually, when all is said and done, we'll go back and we'll reseed everything. That's the only reason why the Halo array was okayed. But now, the same rules do not apply, right? The remnants, I'm just going to call them the remnants of the UNSC and the Arbiter's forces, the Swords of St. Helios. They don't have the same leeway, so to speak. The Halo array is built to destroy the flood. While yes, destroying the flood would probably, end the threat of the flood, they'd still have to deal with the created. And without people to fight your war, how are you supposed to beat a bunch of artificial intelligences? So here's what I predict. Maybe not in Halo 6, but let's say the floods show up. Late game Halo 6. And they are not just, a problem. They actually become a legitimate threat to the created. Naturally, an AI would think, okay, we already have a solution to this problem. Let's activate the Halo array. That would be them thinking logically. As for our heroes, they would naturally think, okay, we've got to stop this from activating, and we've got to find a way to beat these guys, the Flood. So whether it be in Halo 6 or beyond, in my opinion, we'll have a Halo 3-esque type thing where our heroes are forced to deactivate the array, and then they have to deal with the Flood later on. How that will pan out still remains to be seen. We still don't know what the Flood or what the Everlasting One meant by test. Does it mean that if humanity does not activate the array despite the fact that the Flood is breathing down their necks, does that mean that the Flood just drops their weapons and just leaves if humanity passes it? Or does that mean that, you know, humanity will still have to fight afterwards after they've passed their test? You know, it's still up in the air as to what that means, but, you know, for the most part, this is the only thing that makes sense to me. Whether or not it will actually happen remains to be seen. I doubt it. But in the next video, I'll talk about the possibilities of how the Flood could actually return to the Halo universe. And I'll detail ways, you know, from the worst possible way they could be reintroduced to the best possible way that they could be introduced. Anyways, guys, I hope you liked the video. Like, share, subscribe if you want to, and I'll see you next time. Peace.
Yeah, got me in this party all up in the zone. Hottest Betty's trying to take away my cell phone. Like, come and party, I've been trying to shake you off my mind, but just can't get you off me. Keep it moving, they ain't worth it, yeah, that's what my father taught me. But for now, I'm going through the motions of letting go. Cause my mind's telling me yes, but my heart really don't know. Your heart went dark out of nowhere, yet I still see a glow. Swear we had the hottest love, why'd you leave me in the cold? I feel wrong for even writing this poem, you don't deserve it. You stabbed me in the chest and took my heart and left me hurt.